And in this module, we are going to dig into the C of the MVC framework, where C stands for controller. The MVC design pattern has been around for a long time, and it is a design pattern that encourages a separation of concerns, meaning that we don't want to write code that tries to handle too many problems in one block of code. We want to separate the concerns or separate the responsibilities. Perhaps you've also heard of the design principle, the single responsibility principle. The single responsibility principle is a principle you can apply at the class, function, or component level, and it is a principle that the MVC design pattern encourages, because when an HTTP request arrives at our application, there's many different things that we need to do. We need to log the request. We need to query a data source. We need to produce HTML. There's a lot going on. But here's how we apply the MVC pattern to this problem, the MVC pattern that the ASP.NET MVC framework is named after. First, let's imagine a user or a client or some computer sends our application a request, an HTTP GET request, to the URL /restaurants. So I am assuming you know a little bit about the HTTP protocol, and you'll recognize that a GET request is a request to read some information from the application. So someone wants to read about all the restaurants that we have. And with the MVC framework, the first component or the first piece of code that we write that can receive that request will be a controller. So it is a controller that responds to an external stimulus. And one of the things we'll have to do in our application is configure what's known as routing that will route a given request to a specific URL into the code that we write, into the C# code that we write inside of one of our controllers. So assuming that get/restaurants, assuming that request ends up inside of a controller, let's call it the restaurant controller, it is then that controller's responsibility to respond to that request with what the user wants. So if the user wants to see a list of all the restaurants that we know about, the controller doesn't immediately render the HTML that our user wants to see. Instead, the controller is going to build what we call a model. That's the M in the MVC design pattern. We typically want to think of the model as encapsulating everything that the user needs to see on this particular URL. So if I come to your application and I go to /restaurants and I want to see a list of all the restaurants, perhaps I want to also see a count of the total number of restaurants, and let's say restaurants broken down by cuisine type, just a count of how many restaurants serve French, how many restaurants serve Italian and Indian, and so forth. If that's the case, the model, in addition to containing all the restaurant information that needs to be displayed, can also contain the summary statistics that need to display on that page. But the model itself, again, does not render or produce the HTML that is going to go to the client and display in their browser. Instead, the controller, after it builds this model, is going to select a view. I'll often use the phrase, the controller is going to render a view. So a controller gets to pick a view, and the view's only responsibility in life is to produce HTML. So the view takes the model that the controller has put together that contains all the information that needs to appear in that HTML. And the view only is responsible then for producing the HTML and placing the data into the right places in the markup that is being emitted. In other words, the view would never do data access directly. The view would never directly call a web service to get restaurant information. All of that work is taken care of previously inside of the controller or inside of a service that the controller calls. The controller is simply trying to build a model that will respond to a GET request for /restaurants. The controller can then select a view and say, here's the model that you need to present, and the view will render the HTML back to the client browser. This is what the MVC design pattern is all about, and this is what ASP.NET MVC is designed to do. Let's look at a simple example next. So far in this course, we have built an application that will display a list of restaurants on the home page. This is a list of restaurants that we maintain in memory. We haven't placed them into the databases yet. And we also respond to /home/about as well as /home/contact. And we added one additional endpoint here, which was /greeting. And you might remember that came from a controller, which was the greeting controller. And this is where we saw the essence of the MVC design pattern. The greeting controller receives a request for /greeting. It builds a model, which is our greeting view model. It can do that by putting information together from a database or other web services, or in this case, from the configuration for the application. And then this greeting controller says, let's go out and render a view. Since we are rendering a view from the index action of the greeting controller, the MVC framework will go looking for an index view that is a file named index.cshtml in the greeting folder of the views folder. And indeed, that is the sequence of events that will produce this web page that says, have a great day. By the end of this module, what I want to do is have the ability to go to /restaurants and see a list of my restaurants that include links to navigate to the details for a specific restaurant, so sort of a master details view. So have a master view of all the restaurants and have a detailed view of individual restaurants. And before we do that, let me just remind you that the reason we can get to this controller when we go to /greeting in the application is because of the routing information that has been configured in routeconfig.cs in the app start folder. So this single default route says take an incoming URL that is /something/something/ perhaps something else and treat the first segment of that URL as the name of a controller. So /greeting would tell the MVC framework to go looking for a controller named greeting. And then there is no action specified when I have just /greeting, so the default action would be index. But I could go to /greeting/say hello, but that would not find this index method. It would, however, find this method if I name that method say hello, but we will leave this as index. But what about other information that might be in the URL? For example, what about anything that might be in a query string? The query string is a very effective tool when we're doing web programming. The query string effectively allows us to pass a piece of state along in the request. For example, I could have a query string here, and I could say name equals Scott. And now when the MVC framework goes to the greeting controller, it still executes the index method because the query string does not influence the selection of the controller or the action. But let's say this is a piece of information that I want to retrieve. It's not an ID because I'm not saying /greeting/index/some ID. It's simply a query string parameter named name. Well, one way I could access that piece of information is to go to a property that is available inside of every controller known as the HTTP context property. And one of the members of HTTP context is the request property. This request property will tell you anything and everything that you need to know about the current request. So if I wanted to, for example, look into the collection of query string values, I could say, tell me if there is a value for the query string name. This would be one way to access that information. But I just want to tell you, when you're working with the MVC framework, you generally do not need to access the HTTP context property directly. Instead, what I can do is simply say that this method takes a parameter of type string and will give that parameter the name of name. And now the MVC framework is going to try to do everything it can to populate this parameter when it invokes the index method. So the MVC framework is going to go out and look around inside of the request to see if it can find anything with the name of name. And one of the places the MVC framework will look is in the query string. So it will find a name value in the query string. And if I rebuild this project, just to make sure everything compiles, and now let's pass this name along to our view. So inside of the greeting view model, in addition to passing a message, which we get from a configuration file, let's also add a property named name, and then inside of the greeting controller, we are going to say that model.name equals that incoming name value, or let's see what happens if name arrives as null. We'll use the null correlation operator to use the string no name. Let's save that file and come over into the view, and let's add model.name here to the end of the message. Let me save all files and do a build. Let's come back out to the browser and do a refresh. I'm going to refresh /greeting query string name equals Scott, and I can see have a great day, Scott. What if I change the name to Alex? I can also say have a great day, Alex. And as we work our way through the course, we're going to find many instances where behavior like this is helpful. For example, when we need the user to create a new restaurant, and they need to give us a restaurant name and a cuisine type and all that information, how are we going to put that information together inside of an MVC controller? We're simply going to tell the MVC framework about the pieces of information that we need, and the MVC framework will be able to go out and find those pieces of information. Now, what happens if I do not pass a name? In that case, you'll notice I get the value no name, and that simply means the MVC framework did not find a value for name anywhere in the request, so it passed in a null value for that parameter. And the last bit I want to show here before we move on is that if I try to do something sinister, which you always have to be careful about when you're echoing user input back into the page. So for example, if I try to create a script tag here and try to pop up a JavaScript alert that says hello, that particular request is going to be rejected because ASP.NET has some built-in protections. So if it sees an incoming HTTP request that contains markup in something like the query string, the request is just going to be rejected. There's a way to disable that feature of ASP.NET, but in general, it can be very dangerous to receive markup from the user, particularly if you're going to echo that input back onto the page. That is how cross-site scripting attacks happen. The other protection I have from cross-site scripting attacks, in addition to this feature, which will flat out reject the request, is the feature that Razor views will do HTML encoding by default. So even if my application would accept that incoming markup, my Razor view would display that markup as inert text when I rendered model.name. So that's just a quick security tip for you. You can try it yourself. You could try putting HTML markup in the message and see what Razor renders. There is a way to force Razor to render the raw HTML, but we'll talk about that later in the course. For right now, I want to talk about two types of controllers that are available with the MVC framework. We know that the C in the MVC Design Pattern stands for controller, and in the design pattern there's really only one type of controller. A controller is always a component that responds to some external stimulus, like an HTTP request, and the controller builds some model and uses some view to render that model. In ASP.NET, I want to tell you that there's really two different types of controllers. Both of these controller types are still just controllers when it comes to the MVC design pattern, but when it comes to MVC, the framework, the specific implementation provided by ASP.NET, there are some subtle differences between these two different types of controllers. The first type of controller is the controller like we see here with the greeting controller. This controller derives from a controller base class that is in the system.web.mvc namespace. This type of controller is designed to respond to an HTTP request by building a model and returning a view to render that model. This type of controller is really optimized for building web applications. These are applications that primarily render HTML to a browser. So a user interacts with this application by using a browser, by filling out forms and clicking buttons in the browser window. All that results in HTTP messages that are sent here to my server and handled by a controller. They're handled by a controller which builds a model. It can do that by talking to an in-memory data source or to a SQL database or to a document database, talking to a configuration file, but ultimately it builds that model and then selects a Razor view to render that model and send HTML back to the client, to the browser. The other type of controller is what we call the Web API controller. The API controller, as the name implies, is designed and optimized for building APIs. So instead of using a browser, if my customers and my clients, they're all writing software in C# or JavaScript or some language and sending me HTTP messages programmatically, and all I want to do is respond using JSON or XML or some standard data format like that, that is the scenario that Web API controllers are optimized for. So the controller in system.web.mvc, that's best used when you're building HTML. The other controller, the Web API controller, is best used when you want to build something that consumes JSON or XML or produces JSON or XML. So when I go to see a list of all the restaurants in this application, if I want to take that model, the list of restaurants, and produce HTML, the best class for me to use is the system.web.mvc controller. On the other hand, if I want to take my model and instead render or produce JSON or XML, then I should use the Web API. So we will talk more about the Web API later in this course, but most of this module and most of this course is going to be using the system.web.mvc controller. I do, however, want to provide a little demo so you can see what an API controller looks like. So to do that, I'm going to right-click on my project and I'm going to say that I want to add a new folder, and I'm going to give this folder the name API. This is not required, but I've decided that I'm going to keep my API controllers in an API folder and my regular controllers, the system.web.mvc derived controllers, keep them in a controllers folder. So neither of those folders are technically required, but this is a pattern that you'll see in many MVC projects. And now to add a Web API controller, there's several different approaches that I could use to do this. I could right-click and say that I want to add a new item. And under New Item, I could select that I want a controller or that I want a Web API controller. But I'm going to go to New Scaffolded Item. I'm going to make this selection, and it's from here where you can clearly see there is the concept of an MVC5 controller, and that is the system.web.mvc type of controller, so something that is typically used for producing HTML. And then there's also the Web API controller, technically Web API version 2. This is what I want to add. I'm going to click the Add button, and I will have to give this controller a name. Let's just go ahead and give this controller the name of Restaurants Controller. So you're going to see many similarities between MVC controllers and API controllers. They have some of the same naming conventions. So I'll give this controller a name that ends with the word controller, and I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to make sure that I do this under the API folder. So let me just go ahead and say Add New Scaffolded Item, Web API 2 Controller, and I'm going to say Restaurant Controller. Let's go ahead and click Add. Visual Studio will now run some scaffolding and make a few changes to my project. It will add a restaurantscontroller.cs file to my API folder. I expected that. It also added a readme.txt file that I can view here. And I can see that the scaffolding has added the full set of dependencies for ASP.NET Web API 2. So I have all the references and NuGet packages that I might potentially need inside of this project. But as the README states, there may be some additional changes that are required to enable this Web API 2 to work. So there's some configuration that has to take place for Web API to work. What I need to do ultimately is look inside of global.asax.cs, make sure it has these two namespace references. Let me copy those. Make sure it has an application start method, and make sure that I have a piece of code that will call into a method that will configure the Web API to work appropriately. So let's go ahead and scroll down here to global.asax. Here's the global.asax.cs code behind file. I'm going to open that up. I'm going to paste in those two using statements that I copied from the README file, and I can see that I already have system.web.routing included. That's good, so I don't need to add that line, but I have added a using statement for system.web.http, and then going back to the README file, I also need to make sure that this method is inside of the application start method. So the application start method is in this file. It already exists. And what I want to do is paste in this line of code that says global configuration.configure web API config.register. I'll tell you what this does in just a second, but I just want to point out for right now to make sure that you place this line of code above the line of code that says route config.register routes. You might remember we talked about route config a little bit earlier. Route config, if we open that up, tells the MVC framework what rules to apply to map an incoming URL to a specific controller. So we've already seen that /greeting will go and look for something called the greeting controller. Now let's open up the method that is specified here, which is web API config.register. Once again, this is trying to ultimately invoke a method that will configure the framework to behave the way I need it. And in this case, this register method is a static method on a class, web API config, that is in this file that has been added to my app_start folder. So again, everything inside of here, code that I need to execute during startup to configure the framework and the application to behave the way I need. And this part of the configuration is dedicated to the Web API. Now I'm going to toggle back and forth between route config and Web API config because you'll notice there are very similar settings here. Both of these configuration methods essentially tell a framework to say, take a URL like this and map the first part to a controller name, and then take an action name and then an ID. So something like greeting/index would go to the index action or the index method on the greeting controller. Web API config.cs, very similar, but notice this starts off with the literal text API, which just means that the URLs that I need to reach my API controllers are going to start with API. So in order to reach the restaurants controller, that we just scaffolded into the project, I would need to go to /API/restaurants to reach that particular controller. Let me copy that string, because what I want to do is go ahead and do a build in Visual Studio just to make sure everything works and everything is up to date. It looks like the build has worked. And now let me do a Control F5 to run this application in a browser. And I want to take that URL that I just copied and paste it up here. So I want to go to /API/restaurants, and I'm going to see an error message. But it's not just any error message, it's an error message in XML. Because in a way, the Web API framework knows that I'm sort of trying to reach this restaurants controller, but there's really no action, that is no method on this controller that matches this request. And instead of just displaying a typical HTML-based error page, it's going to return an error message, but in XML format. Let's see if we can add something to that restaurants controller, which I almost got to through /API/restaurants by adding some code to that controller. So let's open up the controller, the restaurants controller, so I can see that the routing rules are very similar, but one difference between API controllers, which you can see is the base class here, and HTML controllers or MVC controllers, is that with MVC, the method that I want to reach is typically in the URL. In other words, /greeting/index would say go to the index action on the greeting controller. With Web API, there is no action specified in this string. Instead, the action that you're going to choose is typically based on the HTTP method that is used. So HTTP methods include get, put, post, and delete. Those are the 4 common verbs that we have. And if I write a piece of JavaScript that is going to do an HTTP post to a certain controller or a certain URL like /API/restaurant, the Web API will say, oh, this is an incoming post message. Let me look for an action or a method named post. So in a browser, if I just send off a request to /API/restaurants, that is an HTTP GET request. So the HTTP method being used is GET, and that means inside of this controller, if I create an action named GET, I should be able to respond to this incoming request. Let me just write a simple method that returns the string hello world. I will do a build of this project. Let's come back to the browser and let's do a refresh. And I can see that my API controller, the surrounding Web API framework, has taken the model that I've built, which in this case is just a simple hard-coded string, but it could be a list of restaurants that I query from a database, let's say. It's taken my model and it's serialized it for me into XML. And it's doing that by default because of the specific headers that this browser sends. I could also make a request to my web service, to my Web API, and request the information be in JSON format, in which case I'd get back a JSON string. So now that we know just a little bit about API controllers, so now before we leave this topic of API controllers temporarily, let me just show you an example of how we could return restaurant information. To see a little more how an API controller compares to an MVC controller, let's go ahead and work through the scenario where I want a restaurants controller to return a list of the restaurants. The list will be in XML or JSON format. And ultimately, this controller is going to end up looking a lot like the home controller. The home controller currently on the index action, which is the home page of the application, we need access to a database. We tell the database layer to give us all the restaurants, and we're going to use a view to render those restaurants inside of a table or inside of a list. We need to do something similar with our API-based restaurants controller, including getting access to the data source. So once again, I don't want to instantiate some sort of restaurant data object directly. I want to be able to write a controller and ask the framework to inject and provide for me something that implements iRestaurant data. And we will just call this DB. Once again, I'll place my cursor here on iRestaurant data, hit Control period. That's in the odefood.data.services namespace. So I will select that entry and press enter. And then I will also place my cursor over the DB parameter and select the option to create and initialize a field with the same name, DB. So doing that will give me a private read-only field where I save off the value that is in that parameter. Now I have access to a data source. So inside of get, I can say that my model, is what happens when I ask this data access component to give me all the restaurants. And now, instead of returning a view, which will take that model and present that model in HTML, things are a little bit simpler because all I want to do really now is return the model. It turns out that the Web API framework can figure out how to serialize this object. It can figure out the best format for the client that is trying to reach me. But there will be a compiler error because I'm no longer returning a string. Instead, what I'm returning is an IEnumerable of restaurant. So I will also need to bring in the odefood.data.models namespace. And now I have code that compiles, but is not necessarily going to run. Let me go ahead and do a build on the project. Let's come back to the browser. And now instead of displaying hello world, I will receive another error message in XML. An error occurred while trying to create a controller of type restaurants controller. Make sure that the controller has a parameterless public constructor. We went through this exercise before. Unfortunately, the MVC framework and the Web API framework, they are two separate frameworks that get rolled up inside of ASP.NET MVC. But since they are two separate frameworks, they have different configuration systems and different approaches to resolving dependencies. So you might remember previously in the course, we came into our global.asax.cs file and we created a container, an inversion of control container that is using AutoFact behind the scenes. And we plugged that container into the MVC framework by setting a dependency resolver. So dependency resolver, the set resolver method is a static method on this class dependency resolver. And you'll notice in the pop-up window that dependency resolver is in the system.web.mvc namespace. So this is the dependency resolver for the MVC framework. I also need a dependency resolver, the one that is associated with the Web API framework. So the easiest way to do this is going to be to reuse this register container method and have this method register a container for both the MVC framework and the Web API framework. And what I will do is pass in the Web API configuration that this register container method needs to modify. So that particular configuration, the Web API configuration, is in a class system.web.http.globalconfiguration. So system.web.http, the primary namespace for everything Web API. And what I want to do is walk up to that class, and it has a static property that is available, which is configuration. So now I will be passing in an instance, an HTTP configuration object. So back in container config.cs, let's take an HTTP configuration object, and I will name that parameter using the name HTTP configuration. I do need to bring in the namespace, which is, again, system.web.http. That lets me know I'm dealing with the Web API. And this HTTP configuration will have a property available, which is dependency resolver. So you might be wondering why these two frameworks are so different, Web API and MVC. They just evolved differently. So ASP.NET MVC uses a static method on a class called Dependency Resolver. The Web API went this approach of having an instance of HTTP configuration where you have a property on that configuration object, which represents the Dependency Resolver. But this is what I need to set. And now instead of setting it to an AutoFact Dependency Resolver that wraps a container, I need to set this to an instance, so I'll still use the new keyword, of an AutoFact Web API Dependency Resolver. Now this class does not exist in this project, that's why I have a red squiggly here, and unfortunately it exists in yet another NuGet package that we do not have installed. But if I place my cursor there and press Control period, Visual Studio is smart enough to say, oh, I know about this particular type. It's in a NuGet package that I know about, a NuGet package autofact.webapi2. So if I scroll down and select that option, I can also tell Visual Studio to go ahead and find and install the latest version. And Visual Studio will go out and find that package and download it, and it is now available for me. And that's the same thing that would have happened if I would have right-clicked on the project and said, Manage NuGet Packages, and gone out and found that and installed that package myself. Ultimately, in both cases, that package will be listed here inside of packages.config. And yes, there's autofact.mvc5 that we installed manually earlier, and here's autofact.webapi2 that Visual Studio just installed for me. So now, unfortunately, we have to go through all this configuration for that little bit of code inside of our controller to work, but now that this is in place, it will work for all future Web API controllers that we place into the project. There's just one more thing that we have to do. When we build this container, we had registered in this container all of the regular MVC controllers that are in this application. But we also need to register our API controllers that are in this application. So I'm going to copy this line of code and I'm going to paste it, but change the method call so that in addition to registering regular MVC controllers, we also register API controllers. So just a little bit of setup has been required here. I'm going to press Control B to build, and I obviously missed a semicolon down here on the bottom line. So let's try Control B, Control Shift B to build again. I have a project that is built successfully. Now what I should be able to do is refresh /API/restaurants, and yes, I am now dealing with an array of restaurants, and I can see the 3 restaurants that are in my data source. This is in XML because the particular headers that my browser, Firefox, sends to the web server will indicate to the web API that the preferred format here is XML. But I could also explicitly ask for JSON. In fact, if I switch over to the console real quick, and I'll just do this as a quick demonstration, I have the Windows subsystem for Linux installed inside of Windows, so I can use the curl utility to send off a quick web request. What I'm going to do is copy this URL and say that I want to send off a curl request to /API/restaurants. And you can see in this case where I don't explicitly send any headers that indicate the type of data I want, I get back an array of objects in JSON format instead of XML. Now with curl, I have a little more control over explicitly what is going to happen here because I can specify my accept header. So I can say I want to accept application/JSON, and my response will be in JSON, or I could say I want to accept application/XML to receive my response in XML. So the Web API has a feature known as content negotiation that tries to figure out what does the client want. Do they want JSON? Do they want XML? And it can modify the serialization accordingly. But for now, let's leave the API controllers for later in the course and just focus on building HTML applications with our MVC controllers. Now that we have an API endpoint for restaurant information, let's create a dedicated section in the application to not only show restaurants, but also ultimately edit, create, and delete restaurants. Currently, all we have is on the home page, I'm showing a list of the 3 restaurants that we pull out of the in-memory database we've come up with. But I want a dedicated section, so I want to be able to see restaurants here in the menu. And I want to be able to click on that entry to go to a list of restaurants, and I want to be able to drill into specific details about a restaurant, as well as create and edit and delete restaurant information. To manage all those features, I'm thinking about another restaurants controller, but this time not an API controller for restaurants, but a regular MVC controller for restaurants. So this controller that I'm about to build, it will still be named restaurants controller, but hopefully by now you'll be able to see that when I go to /API/restaurants, I'm looking for an API controller. With this new controller we're about to build, by going to /restaurants/index or /restaurants/detail, I want to go to a regular MVC controller. So once again, let's get some help by scaffolding out this feature. I'm going to right-click on the controllers folder, and I want to add a new scaffolded item. And let's start off with an MVC5 controller that starts off just empty. And we will call this a restaurants controller. By default, what I will have scaffolded here is a controller that has an index action that returns the default view for this particular action. So remember, over in the views folder, I will now have a folder dedicated to the views for this controller. So that's the restaurants folder. And it's inside of here where I will be able to ultimately find views like index.cshtml. You'll notice that file does not appear inside of this folder. That's because we didn't scaffold a controller with a view, we just scaffolded an empty controller. And really one of the easiest ways to scaffold this controller is to right-click inside of this method and say that I want to add a view. The tooling in Visual Studio is pretty smart. It will come up and say, yes, the view name is index. For right now, let's just scaffold out an empty index to make sure we can get this to work. And inside of this index, let's just say hello. If I do a build in the project, Shift Control B, it should come as no surprise that if I go to localhost port whatever and go to restaurants, so not /API/restaurants, but just restaurants, I indeed see that view that I just created that says hello. But how can I come to this URL without typing in the address bar? In other words, I want another entry up here that will allow me to just click on a name for restaurants and be able to come to that URL. Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the course. We talked about the layout view that ASP.NET MVC uses, and this menu is part of the layout view that I want to modify. So I want every page of my application to be able to have a link up here that will take me to the list of restaurants, and we can then remove that feature here from the home page. So first, let me come into the index view for the home page. I just want to go ahead and remove the display of restaurants that we have. We could still tell everyone how many restaurants are in the database. We're just not going to list the restaurants on the home page. But I do want to be able to navigate to the restaurants controller. So inside of the shared folder is where I can find the underscore layout file. It's inside of here where we will find the navigation menu for the entire application. It's right here where I can find the links that I can click on to go to the index action of the home controller, or the about method of the home controller, or the contact method of the home controller. What I need is just one more entry inside of here. So one more call to the HTML helper known as action link. And what will action link do? Action link will take the parameters and the information I'm giving it and figure out what is a link, what is the URL that I can formulate inside of an anchor tag. So I was trying to build an anchor tag with an href attribute. What is the link that I can place in the href attribute that will lead to this action on this controller? So first of all, for a controller name, I want the restaurants controller. And I'm going to copy that bit of text because it turns out that's the text I want to display to the user. I also want to display restaurants there. And then what is the name of the action that I want to reach on that controller? The name of the action that I want to reach is the index action. So behind the scenes, action link will take these pieces of information and it will go consult the configuration that the MVC framework has and says, if I want to reach the index action of the restaurants controller, what URL should I use? And that's what would be placed into the href attribute for the anchor tag that gets created here. Let's go ahead and do a Shift Control B to build the project and come back to the browser. I want to refresh. I see those restaurants disappear. I see a new entry for restaurants up here. And indeed, it does point to /restaurants. Notice that the logic in the MVC framework determined that, oh, since you want to go to the index action of the restaurants controller, and since the index action is the default action for every controller, then all I need to do is specify a URL of /restaurants. That will take you there. So now I can start to navigate through these different features of the application. And with that in place, let's next build out our list of all available restaurants. If we want this view to show a list of restaurants, then back in our controller code, inside of the restaurants controller, we should build a model that includes a list of all the restaurants that we want to display. So let's go ahead and add a constructor. I want something that implements iRestaurant data. We'll call it DB. Press Control period to bring in the namespace odafoo.data.services. Press Control period again to create and initialize a field named DB using this incoming parameter. And now I can build a model, and I can say that my model will be what happens when I invoke the getAll method, and I can now pass this model along to the view to render a table. So very simple logic inside of my controller action. And now let me delete the existing index view that is inside of the restaurants folder. I'm going to delete that view because we're going to recreate that view to display a list of restaurants instead of just saying hello. So again, right click inside of the controller action. I'm going to say that I want to add a view. Again, it will be the index view, but instead of a template being the empty template, notice these different template types that are available. And I know if I'm working with a list of something, whether it's a list of employee or a list of albums or a list of restaurants, anytime I have a list, I can select the list template to scaffold out most of the HTML that I would need to display that list. All this dialog needs to know is what is my model class. So I'm going to type in restaurant and that is correct. It's the odefood.data.models.restaurant. I'll leave all these other settings in place. We'll talk about things like partial views later in the course. For right now, I'm just going to click Add, and what should come out is an index view that already has an @model directive that says the model type for this particular view is going to be an IEnumerable of restaurants. So it's going to be a collection of restaurants. It's also going to execute a little bit of code to set the title property of viewBag. We're going to come back and talk about that a little bit later in the course. It's going to have an action link to a method or an action on my restaurant's controller that doesn't exist yet, but we'll create it in the next module. And that will be a link that will allow me to create a brand new restaurant. And then everything after that is really about setting up a table to display information about all the restaurants that I have. So here's the opening piece of my HTML table. Notice we'll have a row with some headers inside. This first header will say basically this is the column to display the restaurant name. And then just like we had when we were displaying a list of restaurants, an unordered list, we're going to set up a for each loop, but now instead of displaying list items, we're going to set up table rows with table cells inside. And we're being introduced to some new HTML helpers here, display name for and display for. So once again, these are HTML helpers that are just trying to make it easy to create HTML based on metadata and information that is available in your application and on the objects that you're using. So when I use html.displayNameFor, this particular method is just trying to put together some text that it should show the user, so what to display for this particular property name. That's a little bit confusing because the property name is name, but what I'm saying is, give me the name that I should display for this particular property, whatever it is. And that's written as a lambda expression here. Now I will show you later in the course how you can add specific attributes and metadata to your application to influence how these HTML helpers behave. And that can be very useful because you can write a single model class and use that to drive certain features in your user interface, like what text gets displayed, what validation rules are applied. Is a null value or an empty value legal in this particular property or not? We'll see all that later in the course. And then down here inside of the table, in the rightmost table cell, there will be a collection of links that will allow me to do things like edit a restaurant, go to the details for a specific restaurant, or delete a restaurant. We'll talk about this additional parameter here in just a bit. And of course, we don't actually have edit, details, or delete as methods or actions inside of our controller, but we will be adding those features throughout the rest of the course. For right now, I just want to see if this is working by doing a quick build. That will make sure that all my files are saved. I'm going to come back out and refresh the browser when it's sitting on the /restaurants URL. So again, that should render the index action of the restaurants controller. And there I can see in a nice format the list of all my restaurants, and I have the ability to interact with those. If I try to go to one of these actions, like show me the details for that particular restaurant, I will have a 404 not found error. And that's the MVC framework saying essentially, sorry, but I couldn't find a details action on the restaurant's controller. We'll be filling all that information out, but notice one thing that doesn't appear here is the cuisine type. And of course, if you're building something that is your own model or you're using restaurants, but you're adding more properties to your restaurants, of course you could have as many columns here as you want, displaying as much information as you want about a restaurant. But we're going to rely on the details view to provide most of the details that we want to see about a restaurant. Let's implement that next. Inside the application, let's try to go to the details for Scott's Pizza. Notice the link that I'm clicking on down in the lower left of the browser window in the status bar. You can see I'm about to go to /restaurants/details/1 because Scott's Pizza is the restaurant with an ID of 1. But when I navigate to that URL, I receive a 404 not found error. Let's hit the back button and then try to fix that particular problem. So inside of the restaurant's controller, the MVC version of the restaurant's controller, what I need is a public action, so a method that returns action result named details. Now to display the details of a particular restaurant, I'm going to need the identifier of that restaurant. And the good news is that ID is included in the URL. So when I go to /restaurants/details/1, that value 1 in the third segment is going to be the ID that I need. And as we saw earlier in this module, if I ask for an ID parameter to this action, the MVC framework will do everything it can to find something by the name of ID. So it is going to look in the query string, but it's also going to look in the data that was extracted from the route. So of course in route config, that third segment of the URL is a piece of information that I told the MVC framework to identify as an ID. So that becomes a parameter. And over here in restaurant controller, I should be able to receive that ID just by asking for the value here inside of the controller action. I expect it to be an integer, but in reality that ID could be anything. It could be a string, for example. But let's treat that as an ID. And my model should be the restaurant that has that identifier. Currently, the only thing we can do with iRestaurant data is get all of the restaurants. So I'm going to need a new method that will allow me to query for a single restaurant by ID. Let's go over into the services that are available in odefu.data because I want to change iRestaurant data. In addition to a getAll method, I want a method that will return a single restaurant. And let's just call it get. You pass in an ID, and I expect this method to return just a single restaurant that it finds by that ID. Now we will need to implement that method in our in-memory restaurant data source. And if I place my cursor here on the interface that I want to implement iRestaurant data, Visual Studio has detected that I have not completed the implementation of that interface because I am missing this get method. But if I press Control period, I can implement the interface again, and Visual Studio will generate that method for me. This will throw a not implemented exception, but let's remove that and return restaurants. And let's use the link operator first or default. So what I'm going to say is, given a restaurant R, give me the first restaurant where the ID property matches this incoming ID, or if you cannot find a single restaurant like that, just return the default value for the restaurant type. Restaurant is a reference type, so the default value would be a null. So here I will either get back a reference to a restaurant, or I will get back a null reference. And coming back to the restaurant's controller, if I save all my files, I should now be able to say db.get and pass in the ID. That is going to be my model, and ultimately what I want to do is return a view that consumes that model. Currently, that view does not exist because by default that will look in the restaurants folder of the views folder, and it will look for a view named details.cshtml. That does not exist, but once again I can right click on this method, say that I want to add a view, and yes, I do want the view name to be details. Now the template that I want to select will be the details template. This particular template assumes you're going to pass in a model that will be a single object of the following type. So I'm going to type in restaurant, so it's going to be a single restaurant. And what the scaffolding engine in Visual Studio will do is analyze that particular model and generate a view that will display all the properties and all the values for that restaurant. So let's click Add, and I now have a view that is strongly typed to take a model type of restaurant. It's going to display in an H2 tag that this is a details view. Let's go ahead and add @model.name here. So we can say details for and provide the restaurant name. And another way to do that is to use html.displayFor. What's the difference between the two? Well, html.displayFor will use additional metadata to format the name. So if I just say details for and then @model.name, I'll always just be showing the model name. But there's data annotations and data attributes that I'll show you later in this course that you can attached to the model to influence the behavior of displayFor. And I can say things like, if the name is a null value, instead display this string. And I can also do some fancy formatting. So when it comes to properties that are of type decimal or double or float, I can say to display this particular value using so many digits after the decimal point. I can format dates so they display without the time portion of the date or times without the date portion, and so forth. And you'll notice I basically have a view that is using DL and DT elements to display just the restaurant name. But remember, we also have a restaurant cuisine. And you might be wondering why that's not showing up. And it's just that the scaffolding engine with Visual Studio doesn't take to enum types that well. So it's just not going to display them by default. But it's going to be easy enough to add. Let me copy the DT and the DD cell and say that I want a display name for the cuisine, and I want to display the value for cuisine. So display name 4 is displaying the name for this property. And what is the name for this property? It's going to come out as cuisine. And this is displaying the value for that particular property. So again, it would be easy enough for me to hard code here just cuisine, and it would be easy enough for me to say just @model.cuisine here. But sometimes using these HTML helpers is beneficial because you can drive different behaviors and different displays in your application just by attaching different pieces of metadata to the model. And I promise we'll see that later in the course. For right now, let me save all the files and do a build. We should now be able to respond appropriately when I click on the details for Scott's Pizza. And indeed, I do now arrive at the detail views that will show me the name of the restaurant in the header, as well as the name of the restaurant here and the cuisine here. So we're dealing with a very small model. It really only has two properties of any significance plus an ID property. But obviously, you can build this view to handle as complex a model as you need. So if you have a department model that has a collection of employees and every employee has a collection of addresses, you can use a series of loops to display all that information on the details page. There's nothing in the MVC design pattern or the MVC framework that will limit your abilities. So notice this details view, when I scaffolded this view, also provides a link to edit a restaurant. We're not quite there yet. We'll look at that in the next module. I also have a link to go back to the list, so back to the list of all restaurants, and I can go to any restaurant now. But what happens if instead of going to /restaurants/details/3, which is a restaurant that exists, what happens if I try to go to a restaurant identifier that does not exist? Now I have a bit of a problem because the application is unhappy. It's thrown an exception. I can see inside of one of my Razor views, I now have an exception, object reference not set to an instance of an object. And this probably is not the behavior that I want to have in my application. So let's see if we can make this a little bit better in the next. We can see in the details of the exception that we're getting a null reference exception when we're trying to create a link to edit a restaurant and using the expression model.id. Obviously, model is null when we try to reach a restaurant that doesn't exist, and we allowed our data layer with that link first or default operator to return a null value when it doesn't find a given restaurant. So one way to solve this problem would be to modify our view to not make assumptions that there will always be a model. So I could place a statement in this view, something like if model equals null, and then branch and display different HTML when model is null. But in general, I try to avoid that type of logic inside of a view. That type of logic really is better handled at the controller level because the controller should be able to look at the model and say, oh, I tried to query for a specific restaurant and we didn't find that restaurant. If we didn't find that restaurant, why am I trying to render the view that displays all of the details for a specific restaurant? I should do something else, have some different behavior instead. And that's where we can discover there's actually a number of different helper methods on a controller that allows us to return different types of action results. So I can say if the model is null, then I want to special case this and I want to do something other than returning the default view, which is the details view. What I could do is return an HTTP status code to the browser that will tell the browser to please redirect somewhere else. So what I could do is say, no, please redirect this request and go back to the index action on the same controller. And yes, I can also use redirect to action to redirect to an action on a different controller if I wanted to. I could also return a view, and one of the parameters to this view method is the view name. So if I pass in a string as the first parameter to the view method, that is not using that string as a model. Instead, what I'm saying is go out and find the view named not found. And so remember, the controller does get to select which view will render. In this case, I can say return the view that says, sorry, we didn't find that restaurant, versus the view that actually displays the details for a restaurant. All I need to do in this situation now is add a view called not found. I will use an empty view. Let's go ahead and click add, and let's just change the display around. We can say, sorry, that restaurant is not found. I'm going to save this file. I'm also going to come over into the details view, and I'm going to copy this line of code that generates a link that goes back to the list of all restaurants. So let's place that here to make it easy to navigate back to the entire list. Let's do a build on the project, And let's come out to the browser, and now if I refresh /restaurants/details/11, instead of receiving an error page, I receive a page that says, sorry, that restaurant is not found. Now I can click to go back to the list of all restaurants. And that's a much nicer user experience than what we had before, where there's an error on the screen. And now, let me just give you a little bit of a tip that will give you some more information about routing in ASP.NET MVC. At the beginning of this module, I already showed you how, with ASP.NET MVC, I can pass and receive parameters in the query string, and I can receive a value that's in the query string inside of a controller action and use that value. Knowing that, let me just show you what happens if I come in and I change my routing configuration a little bit. What I'm going to do is, instead of saying that I have an ID in this position, I'm going to say that I have something named key. So the key for the restaurant that I want to see. And just to make this example complete, let's just say that key is also an optional value. So the MVC framework doesn't need to see this in a URL. It is optional. But when someone wants to pass me a key, it's going to appear in the URL. Let me just show you a difference in the application now. If I do a build and I do a refresh on my list of restaurants, and I come in to go to the details for Mango Grove, I just want to point out that the ID is now passed in the query string. So again, the HTML helper that we are using to generate that link, the HTML helper that says, please generate a link to the details action on the restaurant controller, and by the way, pass along something named ID with the value of 3. Now that particular HTML helper, when it consults the routing configuration, it does not see a way to pass the ID in the URL because the route config now only has controller and action and key. But that doesn't stop us from generating a link because I can also pass information in the query string. So I can say query string ID equals 3, and that will bring me to the appropriate restaurant. I can even say /restaurants/details/5, query string ID equals 3, and still end up on the same restaurant because that key value, the value 5 that the MVC framework, I told it was a key value, that's available to the controller, we just don't use it. But now typically something that it really identifies a resource, like this ID value, it really identifies a specific restaurant that is in my system. I really want that to be part of the URL, part of the path of the URL, not just a query string that is almost sort of an optional parameter that modifies an existing query to a resource. I really do want that to be part of the URL. So I'm going to come back into route config and press Ctrl-Z to undo my changes, make sure that anytime someone wants to pass an ID, it can appear in the URL. So let's do a build. Let's come back to the list of all restaurants. And now, when I go to the details for Mango Grove, I can see my ID is back in the URL. But anytime when you're trying to work with something that you want to appear in a URL segment, or you're using an action link HTML helper, and that action link is placing something unexpectedly into a query string, now you know that what the software is doing is trying to work with the routing rules that are configured in your application to make sure the information is passed along appropriately. And if it's appearing in the query string, that means the software didn't find a way to place that particular value into the URL. And so at this point, we've built in a few more features to our application. We now have the ability to display restaurants. We have a dedicated restaurants link so the user can come see the restaurants. We're showing the details for a restaurant. And in the next module, we can build on this information to start understanding how we can create and edit our models. So how can I create new restaurants and save them in the database? And how can I edit an existing restaurant and create a form that allows the user to fill out information about the restaurant and save that to my data source? That's what we'll be looking at in the next module.